Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. We have a little bit of a special episode for you this week, and hopefully something that we will be doing regularly. It's a show that I'm doing in partnership with our friends over at International Intrigue. If you haven't checked out International Intrigue, they're a great newsletter on things happening in geopolitics. I encourage you to check them out. And so one of the partners there, John Fowler, who's a former diplomat in Australia and a former lawyer, and I have been doing this weekly show to try and pack into 25 or 30 minutes analysis of the things that are happening in the world that are the most important. We're trying to be entertaining and humorous, but also still maintaining fealty to things like objective analysis and authenticity and rigorous research. The goal is that somebody could listen to this at the end of the week and know in 25 or 30 minutes the main things that have been happening in the world, and also that they will stick in your minds a little bit better because we're going to be limiting the amount of time we could talk about each, trying to find some humor in a world that, generally speaking, lately has been pretty topsy-turvy. So we're experimenting with this right now. You'll probably see us post these each week for the next couple of weeks as we iron out the kinks. Would love your feedback. And again, if you want to check out International Intrigue and John's work, highly recommend you do so. If you want to send that feedback, you can send it to me directly at jacob@cognitive.investments. That's also where you can find me if you would like to learn more about our investment services or about speaking gigs or about whatever books that you're reading lately that you think that I should be on top of. Other than that, I hope you enjoy this special episode. If you are in the United States, I hope you have a good July 4th holiday. Cheers and see you out there.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Fowler, the CEO and co-founder of International Intrigue and a former diplomat in Beijing and Shanghai. With me, as always, is Jacob Shapiro, the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Jacob, what's going on down in New Orleans, as your T-shirt reminds me you're based?
It's that time of the summer when it's a steam room anytime you walk outside. But John, the people want to know what your golf handicap is.
Well, as I think you know is 100% true, it's a 6. It's maybe an 8, no a 6. I mean, is there anything more American than sandbagging your handicap? But we'll get to the debate in a little bit as we're going to cover that in our main story. But first, Julian Assange is a free man now. Bolivia saw what can only be described as a pretty pathetic coup attempt this week. China's lunar probe has returned from the dark side of the moon, and Kenya has been dealing with some pretty violent and intense protests as well. So let's kick it off with the Julian Assange story. So WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange struck a plea deal with the US, which saw him plead guilty to one charge of seeking to obtain and disclose classified material, which is way down from the raft of very serious espionage charges that he was facing from the US government, plus a bunch of different charges from Sweden and everything. Assange is the the founder of WikiLeaks, which started out publishing secrets from places like Somalia, Kenya, Peru, Swiss banks, Tibet, these kinds of places. It really functioned as kind of like the letterbox for whistleblowers on the internet in the late 2000s. He then started leaking classified documents from the US, which obviously angered Washington and really put him on a collision course with the administration. He's got these weird connections to Russia. He hosted a talk show there in 2012, apparently, and I think Russian intelligence agents staged an exfiltration or rehearsed an exfiltration to get him out of the London embassy, the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he was holed up at the time. So something odd going on in Russia with Assange's connections. He's a complicated character. I think he's a very, on one hand, he would paint himself as a whistleblower, calling governments, holding governments to account and calling them out on their corruption and their lies, but obviously he did it pretty recklessly. I think there's been a fair bit of evidence that he at least endangered the lives of government employees around the world, releasing secrets that were not vetted. I think Assange is a pretty weird guy, Jacob, and I actually think a very bad vessel for a much more serious question about ethical whistleblowing and how to do it properly. So I've got two general questions for you. Firstly, why did the US decide to take this plea deal right now when they had been so insistent on pursuing him for the better part of a decade? And what can we do about this problem about how you hold governments to account without being reckless about it?
Well, let's take the question that's easier to answer first, which was your first one. Why did the U.S. decide to cut this deal now? And the answer is, I have no earthly clue. I cannot figure out why the United States did this. And it must be one of those things where those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. But I don't think we'll ever, at least I don't think anytime soon, we will get information. Although maybe somebody will tell WikiLeaks like what was going on behind the scenes and whistleblow on that. I'll also say it's very hard for me to stay objective about Julian Assange. I was at Stratfor. That was where I started my career. And Anonymous hacked Stratfor while I was there and gave all of our emails to WikiLeaks. It was called the Global Intelligence Files. And I had to change my phone number because I was getting lewd text messages from all sorts of unsavory characters.
For which I've apologized.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. And it also just like it didn't actually do anything to Stratfor. Like they thought that we were some kind of private CIA. And instead, they just sort of blew up some people's lives because they published their personal emails on the internet. And like it didn't actually do anything to the company. It just like did some bad things to individuals, which sort of, unintended consequences. And I also wonder if a story like this is even going to be possible in the future. One of the things about WikiLeaks and about this type of whistleblowing is that you can't actually ascertain what was real and what wasn't. Did somebody fabricate a document and throw them in with a bunch of other documents, and then you can create a whole narrative around this sort of thing? And I think it actually points to me to the potential value of blockchain technology, to the value of cryptography and of secure data centers for internal communications and things like that. It's also like what Biden had classified documents in his garage. Trump had them down at Mar-a-Lago. Like you can get classified documents everywhere that you want. But I do think it really underscores a weakness for the United States and for most democracies, which is the information is out there. Whereas imagine this sort of thing happening in China or Russia. Those people would be dead long before they even got to Julian Assange. So I don't know what to make of why the United States did this now. But I think Assange is honestly, he's sort of, that's like an era ago. It's going to be much more interesting how this evolves going forward.
Yeah, I'm surprised that people still care about Assange. I mean, he's sort of a talisman for this kind of anarchic internet era, which doesn't exist anymore. So I'm surprised people still care about it. But I think something you said at the end there, I actually think whistleblowing / these kinds of leaks are a real kind of a feature, not a bug of democracies. The alternative in China and Russia, but particularly China, because that's where my experience is, these kinds of people become agents that get run by foreign powers. There is no place to kind of let off steam if you don't agree with the government or if you want to leak stuff. And it is almost certainly better to have this stuff in the public arena than it is to have it back channeled to your adversary without realizing it. So in some ways, in maybe now, in an era where you just mentioned that if this stuff is even possible going forward, those people just tell China directly, or they tell Iran, dissenters now in the Biden government who can't handle American policy on Gaza, just go straight to Iran and back channel it there rather than leaking it, which is at least what you've got out there and you can kind of contain it. But I know it's a weird story.
Yeah. Speaking of things that people maybe don't care about or that overemphasize, we had a foiled military coup in Bolivia this week, John. And this is a country that's no stranger to coups. They've had something like over 100 ever since they became an independent state. And I believe it was the 1860s. Anyway, military units led by the now former general Juan Jose Zuniga attempted to take over the presidential palace while hundreds of soldiers took up positions near government buildings. There's a dramatic video of current President Luis Arce confronting the cousters who ended up withdrawing, which is one of the weird parts of the story. Now, this general had actually been fired earlier in the week because he said he wasn't going to let former Bolivian President Evo Morales run for president again. And this is even more sort of confusing because Evo Morales, he tried to defy the Bolivian constitution in 2019. He ran for an unconstitutional third term, won that election, then was exiled, and there was a right-wing opposition government, and then Arce took over. And Arce and Morales have actually been clashing in recent weeks because Arce doesn't want Morales to come back and replace him as the president, but both of them have declared that this coup was not very good. The other interesting thing here is the general is claiming that Arce told him to do this. So if you're a conspiracy theory, there's plenty of room for speculation in general. Aside from the political intrigue, no pun intended, Bolivia is not exceptionally important geopolitically, but it's a regional gas producer. It's got huge undeveloped lithium deposits. It's a landlocked country that sits between Peru, Brazil, and Chile. And if we're talking about the expansion of narco violence, instability, migration, all these other things that have been plaguing South America, here's yet another thing that might lead to that. What did you make of this situation, John?
Well, it's tough to know what to make of it, isn't it? I mean, the conventional wisdom, I think, is that these kinds of events weaken presidents. They weaken the sitting, powers, right? A coup sort of shows that there's a wellspring dissatisfaction with the administration, and this is kind of the outlet for them. So even though it's not successful, you would expect, oh, well, they go back and regroup and maybe they undermine RC in different ways. But I don't know, this doesn't feel like that will be the case. I'm kind of, it was such an incompetent coup. It felt like it was almost like spur of the moment, like, oh, let's go down to the quad and take over the presidential palace. Everyone's doing it kind of vibes. Like, I wonder if they'd been just shotgunning beers in the hours before, because I don't know. It just feels like he was very easily pushed back. The plotters didn't have any kind of to what we know, any kind of insiders in the cabinet, because it looked like there was pretty strong solidarity from the government. And I wonder, it's just like the incompetence actually might strengthen him. I'm not an expert on Bolivian internal politics, so I'm not sure about that. But I think one other thing to note is it's a little bit of a trend recently about the incompetence of coups that have been happening. I'm thinking of Sudan's kind of which is obviously degenerated into a horrific civil war, but with Hamedi, who kind of took over a bit of Khartoum but didn't really succeed and split the country in two, but they've still got two governments. And then obviously the piece de resistance of incompetent coups of Prigozhin in Russia, where he charges up to Moscow, stops, and then quite literally falls out of the sky a couple of months later. And Putin seems to be stronger when I thought that he would probably be weaker. So I don't know what to make of it, other than it feels very incompetent, very spur of the moment. And I don't know that RC is going to be weakened by it, but Morales is a problem in Bolivia. He's not going away, and he may be the only source of instability that country needs to kind of fall apart.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add there is that you've now reinvigorated my book project, Coups for Dummies, coming soon to a bookstore.
There you go. Because that's what we need, more coups. Jacob, this week we had a bit of a different story. We try not to back negativity on this show. So we've got a China lunar probe that has returned from the dark side of the moon successfully. It touched down in Inner Mongolia on Tuesday, carrying the first ever samples of matter, of moon dust, or whatever you want to call it, from the far side of the moon. The China Space Agency launched the Chang'e 6 vessel back on May 3, so it was up there for a bit over a month. And it landed on the far side of the moon, which is difficult because it doesn't have line of sight communications with the vessel, and it safely returned. More interesting than just that isolated incident is that the moon has become a bit of a hot topic in sort of a global moon race, space race kind of vibes. India scored a soft landing on the moon last year. Japan did something called a pinpoint landing on the moon in January. China's now come back with these samples from the dark side of the moon. A US company apparently is going to land a private robotic. They did land a private robotic vessel in February, and Russia's doing the same. I am struggling a little bit to understand why the moon is so back in vogue. But there's probably something that you're going to be able to explain to the rest of us about the end of 30 years of relative peace and unipolarity and the rise of geopolitical competition again, leading to this idea that these countries want to showcase to the rest of the world their technological innovation. And within China specifically, I think maybe that is the reason that they've done this, kind of bragging rights about their innovation, and a good news story for Xi Jinping on the front page of the papers. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, let's whittle down from global to the more local or national. So globally, I think you're exactly right. Space was one of the few areas post the end of the Cold War where countries, no matter how much they disagreed with each other, would cooperate with each other. I remember even in 2014, 2015, being in Europe and meeting with some officials there. And even as things were really tense between Russia and the EU over the first attempt to invade Ukraine, if you want, in 2014, cooperation over the International Space Station never halted. It was one of the only working groups in the EU where they were always working together, where there was some sort of realization that there was something greater than nations involved here and that everybody was working towards this shared paradigm. It was also, when you think about space, it's not just this vast empty expanse. All the satellites that allow your GPS to work so that you can get from point A to point B, so you don't have to learn how to read physical maps. All of this stuff is there, and it worked with relative cooperation between all these different powers. And that, I think, is going away. Two books that I would commend people to read. One is Ghost Fleet and another is 2032. They're both about sort of scenarios for what World War III looks like. It's not a coincidence that both of them begin in space. with China or Iran or Russia or some combination of them attacking U.S.-based dominance, developing weapons to attack U.S. satellites. Then you need counter defenses against those satellites, things like that. So I do think we're headed towards a new space race. The difference is the United States is not taking this one nearly as seriously as it did the first one. The second, and this sort of gets into China itself, I think there's a lot of assumptions about China that because it's an authoritarian regime and a communist sort of Marxist regime at that yes, it has advantages when it comes to size and scale, but that when it comes to real innovation, China's behind the eight ball. And if you still believe that fairy tale, just understand what they've accomplished here with this lunar probe and the things that they are moving towards accomplishing, and you will start to understand that the Chinese economy is actually extremely innovative, and their scientists are extremely innovative. And the things that they are engineering and manufacturing, the things that they're doing are incredibly ambitious and incredibly innovative. So I always like to sort of underscore when something happens with Chinese innovation, because I think it cuts against that consensus view that often anesthetizes sort of Western observers when it comes to thinking about China. And the last point, and maybe this is psychoanalysis, but I can't help making it. First of all, if you haven't watched Three Body Problem on Netflix, go watch it. And if you haven't read it, maybe you should read it too. But I'm struck by how the sort of biggest fictional work in China of the past couple decades, or that has captured the imagination, is the Three Body Problem, which is about aliens discovering Earth and coming here to block Earth, and how the American species, the human species, what a Freudian slip, has to rise up against it altogether. Whereas in English speaking countries, it's been Game of Thrones, like a throwback to medieval times, and we're killing each other, and we have lanterns and things like that. I may be stretching for the analogy there, but I do think there is something there. Anything else you want to talk about the dark side of the moon, John?
No, apart from it being a good album, I think you're absolutely right to point out the China innovation kind of myth. It was a thing I dealt with when I was a diplomat in China, almost 8 years ago now, and it's persisting. And I think you're absolutely right to say it's not true.
Yeah. All right. Well, moving from the celestial to the more mundane, our sort of last thing here is to talk about mass protests that broke out in Kenya this week. So at one point on Tuesday, sections of Kenya's parliament were actually set on fires as protesters overwhelmed police to storm the compound. The reason they're so upset is because the Kenyan government is trying to enact policies that are going to rein in public debt. And what that meant was introducing new taxes on basic commodities like bread, vegetable oil, sugar, a new motor vehicle circulation tax. All of these are new taxes that Kenyans didn't want. And not the ironic thing here, but the thing that is sort of at least disturbing to me is that Kenya was the fastest growing country in sub-Saharan Africa. It has a vibrant business sector. It's supposed to be the stable one in East Africa. And suddenly it's not so stable. And the other question here is, one of the reasons that the Kenyan government was pushing these taxes, it wasn't because they woke up and decided they wanted to take more money from the Kenyan people. It's because the IMF has said, hey, Kenya, if you don't bring your public debt down from 68% of GDP to 55% of GDP, well, maybe you're not going to get IMF funding for all the debt and infrastructure and all the other things that you've sort of depended on here for. I think it's easy to get lost in all the sort of headline issues here, John, but everywhere you look in sub-Saharan Africa, things don't seem to be going well. I wonder what you made of this. I don't know. Is this the beginning of a sub-Saharan African spring, or is there something else going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I hope not. I think the thing that I was thinking about with this is everything that you said I agree with. But it's interesting that Ruto didn't have the political space to deal with this, that he didn't have a mandate to kind of push through things that were going to be short-term difficult for Kenya, but presumably in their long-term interest. And my mind immediately moves to President Javier Milei in Argentina, who has done things far more radical than what the bill that Ruto withdrew. He's been doing things far more radical than that, but he was elected specifically on a platform to do those radical things and to get Argentinian debt under control and inflation under control. So I guess my question is, if this does spread, or if this is a problem that we're going to see crop up across sub-Saharan Africa or even further around the developing world, are the current leaders, elected or otherwise, are they going to have the space to be able to deal with these things? And a lot of the times, the medicine is going to be worse in the short term than the illness, as it were. But are we going to see, I guess the question is, are we going to see a rise of folks like Milei, these even more radical guys and females who come to power saying, we have to basically blow the country up and start again? Because it doesn't look like kind of relatively mainstream kind of politicians have the political space to deal with these kinds of problems.
Yeah, you can't tie a direct link between what's happening in Kenya and what's happening in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but just look at Niger, Burkina Faso, you mentioned Sudan, look at Ethiopia, the DRC. I don't think it's a coincidence that there's all this instability around Kenya. And now one of these economic power centers that's actually been doing well is also flashing red. So I don't even think you have to go to South America. You can look towards the model of Kuster's bringing an iron fist to try and bring things, bring some level of stability and order and wealth to some of these countries. The thing for Milei will be, if it works, if he has success, sure, you might see people copy him all over the place. But there's a long way between him having success and the things that he's been able to accomplish thus far.
Absolutely. All right, Jacob, we've both been somewhat dreading moving on to this next topic, which is whatever we watched last night, the Trump-Biden debate last night US time. It needs no introduction. And I think if you didn't watch it or you haven't heard about it and you don't know what we're talking about, I'm not going to be the one to spoil your zen, and I would suggest you don't listen to what we're about to say because you're a lucky person. But for the rest of us self-flagellating types, I mean, it was a pretty tough 90 minutes to sit through. So I guess firstly, just what was your general reaction to the debate in general?
Well, it's funny. My reaction, I think, was different than what the consensus view very quickly became. And maybe that's because I had such low expectations going in. I thought that if Biden was able to stay mostly coherent and upright the whole time, that would have been success. And I was sort of double checking myself this morning. I went back and listened to Hacks on Tap and a couple of other different podcasts. And that was the narrative. It was, if he could just, stand up straight and throw in a few zingers, he'll be okay. That's what he did. It's just that you were confronted with just how old he really is. And somehow people have woken up today and they're like, oh my God, wasn't that terrible? That's sort of what I was expecting. I thought Biden actually, in a very small way, exceeded my expectations. But again, that's not the main viewpoint. It seems like everybody else is looking at this and being like, oh my God, the Democrats have to pick somebody else. And this man is completely senile and he doesn't understand anything that's going on around him. How can the Democrats possibly continue to put him forward? And then you juxtapose that with Trump, who honestly wasn't that much better. I think one of the reasons Trump gets off here is because he's always spoken in shorter sentences, so people can't notice that he's senile. In the meantime, he's lying and doing everything, being an asshole and everything else that Trump does. And we were joking about it at the top, but then it just devolved to these two old men, fighting about who was better at golf. If you zoom out sort of, and I'd love to hear sort of somebody who is obviously not American originally, sort of how you interpreted it. But the first thing is that the first presidential debate usually does move the polls and usually moves the polls sort of not really in the favor of the incumbent. So 538 went back and looked at this, and only 4 times since 1976 did it actually help. In 76, there was some help for the incumbent, 2016. But generally speaking, things don't go well, and it actually moves the needle quite a bit. And this election is so close that even a small move in the needle is going to affect the bigger picture here. And then the last thing I'd just say is, if you look at the national polls, ever since April, Trump had been leading Biden by a good 1-2 percentage points. Biden actually closed that gap in the last couple of weeks to where it was just about a dead heat. I'm really curious to see what those polls look like next week. Because are people going to have watched the debate and that's going to change their minds about who they're going to vote for? Or is this just the people who were on Twitter were faced with this ghastly spectacle and they decided to tweet about it, but it's not actually changing anybody's minds and the poll numbers maybe stay exactly where they are? I have a hunch that that's what's going to happen and that this is going to pass. But certainly if you look at the op-ed section of the New York Times, like the left is rhetorically self-immolating itself.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with anything you said there, except I would probably take the other side of the first bit in that it seems like your expectations for Biden's performance were lower than mine. I naively, perhaps, I don't watch a lot of conservative news, so I don't get, loops and loops and loops of kind of Biden stuttering around and doing all that kind of stuff. But I think we all knew he was aging, but I didn't see the first 90 seconds happening, and I didn't see that awful moment where he basically just forgot what he was saying and stopped and couldn't regain his train of thought. I didn't expect that to happen. I really didn't. So I was shocked, and I left that debate thinking that he will lose if he goes up against Trump. I didn't think that previously. I've been of the camp that Trump has a solid 41, 42, 43% rain, hail, or asteroid shower. He's going to get that, and it's all about those undecideds in the swing states. And I think the polls are one thing, Jacob, and I think it'll be interesting to see that. But I think it's it's almost more kind of a gut feel, and that if you're a genuine undecided in Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, and you watch that, I can't fathom a person who goes, "Yep, I'm going to go vote for Joe Biden." I don't think you're going to go vote for Trump, because I think Trump, I agree with you, his performance was equally, well, maybe not equally poor, but poor, because he's doesn't make sense when he talks. But it was a disaster, I think.
Yeah, well, there's two things to break apart there. The first is, John, do you know anybody? So Trump is 78, Biden is 81. Do you know anybody who is 78 years old who you think would be a good president or prime minister, or who wouldn't be a little bit off at 9 p.m. at night in a high charge situation?
Absolutely. No, of course not.
So I don't want to sound, actually, I do want to sound age. A 78-year-old man should not be, it's just too old. Like, we need to think very seriously about age limits. And Biden might be perfectly competent if you catch him at a certain point of the day when he can rely on his decades of experience and all of his aides and all of the infrastructure that's around him, which is something Trump doesn't have. It's the Trump show when it's the Trump show. When it's Biden, think about all the aides that he's collected over decades that allows him to be an effective politician, legislator, decision maker, because it's not him at 9:00 p.m. when he should be in bed sort of thinking about this.
And also, he was old when he got elected. And we know what Clinton was president, I think, 30, well, he was first elected 30, what are we now, like 30-something years ago. No, 20, almost 30 years ago. And he's still younger than both the candidates. And look how he aged in office. Look how George Bush aged in office. Look how Obama, who was in his 40s, has aged in office. This guy was already old. He's been doing the hardest, most taxing job in the world for 4 years. It's not surprising, but it's almost negligent at this point, I think, for him to be running for a second term. But before we kind of wrap up, I want to pivot. Do you think this has any kind of international ramifications? Is there anything that, a Putin, a Netanyahu, a Xi Jinping, these kinds of guys, is there anything that they saw last night that would change their calculus about how they operate?
I don't think so. And that's, the fat lady has not sung yet. Like, we still have to get to the actual election. A lot can happen between now and then. Trump can slip on a banana peel. Biden, many things can happen. I'll also say, and before I get to the question about foreign countries thinking about the United States, the other problem here for Biden, and in some ways this is the even deeper mistake, is that Kamala Harris is his vice president, and he hasn't shown any willingness to change that. Because if you do have these legitimate concerns about your age, just say, okay, I get that you're concerned about my age. That's why I have handpicked this person who can be next to me to ensure continuity. And nobody trusts Kamala Harris. She does terrible on all the polls. And if you want to be a centrist candidate who's saving the republic and democracy, like, she's not the person that you want to have there. I've been joking for months. If I was advising Joe Biden in front of me, I would say, reach out to Mitt Romney right now and declare Mitt Romney Republican on a bipartisan ticket to go against the threat that Trump is posing to democracy. That's a win. That's a layup right there. But he's not willing to do that. And I think more than anything else, his insistence that he's okay when he's not okay, that's the biggest problem. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a wheelchair and looked ghastly in the 1940s when he got his fourth term, right? But it was because there was some level of trust in him that is not there with Biden, and the inability to sort of say that and be honest with people. I think in some ways that's the biggest disjuncture of all. And as for how foreign leaders are looking at this, like I said, if you're Putin, you sort of have to wait for the results. I'm sure you have a playbook one way or another, but the one I feel confident about is that Xi Jinping is eating his popcorn, or whatever the Chinese equivalent of popcorn is, and saying, hey, all these things that we've talked about in terms of the Marxist slow decline of the materialist capitalist nation, you're going to tell me that's wrong? This is exactly what we're talking about. We don't have to destroy the United States. That country is going to destroy itself. All we have to do is make sure that we have the best tech in the world, so that in the 2030s, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese dream can fill in the vacuum that is left by these vacuous octogenarians who have no idea what they're dealing with in the world today.
Yeah, two very quick thoughts to wrap up. One, Niall Ferguson, who the sort of vaguely controversial historian, has been talking recently about how this election cycle reminds him so much of late-stage Soviet USSR. Andropov, Brezhnev, these folks who were essentially, formaldehyde-stuffed corpses wheeled out by the Politburo on the balcony to kind of wave every so often, and how it really did damage the Soviet Union. People probably don't think that was a key reason for the dissolution of it, but it was that the leaders it was a gerontocracy, and they became incapable of preserving the empire, I guess. And the second thing, to your point about I guess Biden and his team telling everybody that he's fine is, I can't help but think of the George Orwell quote in 1984 where it says, the party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears, and it was their last and most essential command. And it does feel like over the next couple of weeks, we're going to have the Democratic Party and a lot of his surrogates come out and say, he's fine behind closed doors, don't worry about it. But I just don't think that's going to wash with the American people who saw with their own eyes and heard with their own ears what he was about last night. Well, on that note, Jacob, it's a little bit of a bummer to leave it, but we'll leave it there. Thank you, as always, for joining me.
It's always my pleasure.
And we'll be back next week with more scintillating hot takes on, well, no debates, but other things going on around the world. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, I got to get to the driving range. See you later. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.